Flight attendant calls woman. Too fat for first class, not knowing she's the owner's daughter. Just as the plane was preparing for takeoff, the flight attendant made an unexpected remark to a woman seated in first class. "You don't belong here," she remarked, gesturing towards the rear of the plane. However, what she was unaware of was that the woman she had just embarrassed was far from an ordinary passenger. She was the offspring of the airline's proprietor. The events that followed stunned everyone and would alter the course of the flight attendant's life forever. Stay tuned to discover how a minor error transformed into a pivotal moment in life. Before we begin, please share in the comments your location. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing videos. Emily Harper entered the plane with a serene confidence that flowed down the narrow aisle. Her beautiful curls elegantly framed her face as she made her way toward the first-class section, a leather bag in one hand and her boarding pass in the other. The airport buzzed with activity that afternoon, yet she navigated through the throngs with a serene assurance that set her apart, leaving others unable to pinpoint the reason for her distinct presence. She was impeccably attired in a fitted jacket and a modest dress, each step resonating with determination. The other passengers appeared largely oblivious, offering only the rare sidelong look at the woman's calm presence. Ava concentrated on the task at hand, her thoughts already drifting to the meeting she had planned for when she arrived at her destination. Approaching her seat, she offered a courteous smile to the individual beside her and comfortably took her place without hesitation. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment, the gentle rustling of her items disrupting the typical tranquility of first class. Ava settled into her seat and retrieved a small notebook from her bag, quickly scribbling down a few thoughts. Her environment was serene, tranquil, and concentrated. Oblivious to the slight commotion her arrival created, she focused intently on her tasks, jotting down notes in her notebook. Only when the voice of a flight attendant pierced the soft murmur of the cabin did she finally glance up. Rachel Coleman, a flight attendant, glided down the aisle, her uniform immaculate and her gaze keen. Her precise attention to detail made her a valuable contributor to the airline. As she strolled by, her gaze fixed on Ava. There was something unsettling about the woman in first class, though she couldn't quite identify what it was at that moment. After a brief pause to check the seating chart on her tablet, she approached Ava's seat with a well-rehearsed smile. "Pardon me, miss." Miranda's tone was courteous, yet it carried a distinct sharpness. "May I take a look at your boarding pass, please?" Ava, calm and courteous, glanced up, her expression revealing no trace of worry. With a warm, inviting smile, she presented the boarding pass. "Certainly," she replied. Miranda received the pass and scrutinized it carefully. She briefly frowned while examining the ticket, then shot a quick look back at Ava. "Is this for first class?" Miranda asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Ava replied affirmatively, her tone composed and serene. She went back to her notebook, evidently unaffected by the encounter. Miranda's frown intensified, yet rather than probing further, she returned the boarding pass and nodded sharply. She turned away, yet a subtle uncertainty lingered in her stride, as if she hadn't fully grasped what was amiss in the situation. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes frequently darted back to Ava, yet she remained silent. Ava, on the other hand, ignored her completely, concentrating only on the notes in her notebook. Shortly thereafter, Miranda made her way back. On this occasion, her actions were more intentional. Once more, she paused next to Ava's seat. "Miss Carter," Miranda stated, her voice distinctly more assertive, "I must request that you move aside. It appears there is a problem with your seating arrangement." Ava looked up, her forehead creasing in slight bewilderment. "Is there a problem?" "I'm confused. My ticket has been confirmed." Miranda, on the other hand, remained resolute. "I have already verified. This is not your place." The words had taken on a chill, and the atmosphere was charged with focus. Ava experienced a brief surge of irritation, yet she concealed it effectively, maintaining a serene expression. "I apologize, but I'm unclear on why my seat would pose an issue. This is the seat that has been designated for me." Miranda's face was tense, and her eyes were slightly squinted. She peered down the aisle and then leaned in, speaking softly. "Please relocate, or I will need to involve security. We can resolve this once you're settled in a seat at the back." Ava reclined in her seat, methodically gathering her belongings. The atmosphere changed significantly. The whispers from fellow passengers were becoming increasingly pronounced, yet Ava remained unhurried. At 4:56, she rose gracefully and made her way down the aisle toward the rear of the plane. She lifted her head proudly, though her hold on her bag grew a bit firmer. With every step, more gazes were drawn to her, yet she remained composed as she arrived at the back. Miranda gestured to the vacant middle seat, and Ava acquiesced, taking her place in silence. It felt as though every person in the cabin was observing, creating an atmosphere thick with unease. Ava was indifferent to that. She was unfazed by the murmurs or the sidelong looks. Her thoughts had already soared well past the limits of the airplane. While the plane buzzed steadily, she rummaged through her bag and retrieved her phone, swiftly typing out a few messages. She sent a message, then glanced at her watch, a subtle smile playing on her lips. No matter what was unfolding, she had already initiated a series of events, leaving those around her unaware of what lay ahead. At this moment, the flight maintained its familiar pace as the cabin embraced a soothing hum. However, Ava's calmness was not as it appeared. She was more than merely anticipating the conclusion of the flight. She was poised for her next action. As the plane pressed on with its voyage, Miranda found it difficult to dispel the discomfort that had taken root in her chest. The exchanges she had with Ava instilled in her an odd sensation, one that gnawed at her insides, becoming increasingly disquieting with each passing moment. She had fulfilled her responsibilities, hadn't she? The woman simply didn't belong there, that's all. It was just a typical misunderstanding, wasn't it? Yet there was an unsettling quality to Ava's composed demeanor that left Miranda feeling on edge. As she made her way to the front of the plane to attend to her other responsibilities, her mind remained occupied with the thoughts from earlier. The remaining flight attendants were occupied with their respective duties. However, Miranda's thoughts were not centered on the task at hand. As she attended to the first-class passengers, serving drinks with her characteristic smile, her mind continually wandered back to Ava. It was illogical. She seemed out of her element. Who would reserve a first-class seat if they didn't have a rightful place there? That was the mantra Miranda repeated to herself. Yet the persistent uncertainty lingered on. As she walked down the aisle, she noticed the inquisitive looks from the other passengers. Their gazes were fixed on Ava as she settled into her new seat, serene and poised. A tiny part of Miranda sensed that others might be aware of something as well. The flight went on, yet the unease in Miranda's chest only intensified. She attempted to concentrate on her tasks, yet the sense that something was imminent was impossible to shake off. Ava's serene demeanor only intensified Miranda's mounting anxiety. Each look toward the rear of the plane brought to mind the serene assurance that Ava exuded. What made her appear so composed? What was the reason for her lack of upset? Ava, unlike most people, remained unperturbed at this point. It appeared that she had everything managed perfectly. As Miranda walked past the galley once more, she cast a glance at her fellow crew members, yet her mind continually wandered back to Ava. It didn't take long for her to start contemplating the idea that perhaps she had misinterpreted the circumstances. Perhaps this situation goes beyond merely being a case of a lost passenger. However, Miranda dismissed the idea. She had acted in accordance with her principles. There was absolutely no error, yet that tiny uncertainty remained, unwilling to fade away. Miranda glanced at Ava once more, who was seated quietly at the rear of the plane, jotting down notes in her notebook. Ava appeared utterly serene. This only heightened the stark contrast with Miranda's increasing sense of anxiety. Throughout the flight, Miranda's discomfort persisted. She was unable to dismiss the sense that she had erred, even if she couldn't articulate the reason behind it. Was it merely the discomfort of the moment, or was there something deeper at play? She looked back at the main cabin, where Ava remained seated, her posture upright and her focus unwavering. The flight attendant attempted to dismiss her unease, yet beneath the surface, Miranda sensed she was close to uncovering a truth she was too frightened to confront. The persistent unease would intensify, ultimately compelling her to confront a reality she was unprepared to acknowledge. The flight continued its steady hum, yet Miranda found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on the usual tasks of her day. She found her thoughts wandering back to Ava. The woman seated at the rear of the plane, having been relocated from first class, displayed an unusual calmness for someone in such a distressing predicament. Miranda, in contrast, sensed the burden of her choices growing heavier with each fleeting moment. She responded swiftly, almost on impulse, and relocated Ava without any hesitation. However, at this moment, everything seemed more complicated. Though she couldn't articulate the reason, the more Miranda reflected on it, the stronger her sense grew that she had misinterpreted the situation. Perhaps Ava had been correct from the very beginning. Perhaps there was no error with her ticket after all. But why had no one else observed? What prevented the other crew members from noticing her actions? Surely she wasn't the only one who sensed that something was amiss. Perhaps, just perhaps, Ava wasn't as misplaced as she had appeared. Miranda sensed that something was stirring just out of sight. Ava's demeanor in the back of the plane was striking. She appeared completely unfazed by the situation around her. It wasn't merely her courteous replies or the serene smile she offered when Miranda first approached her. There was an underlying motive, something more deliberate. The more Miranda pondered it, the stronger the feeling of dread grew within her chest. In the galley, Miranda absent-mindedly monitored the supplies. Her movements were more sluggish than normal, as though she were navigating through a thick haze. She moved through the aisles once more, gathering empty cups and providing drinks. Yet whenever she glanced toward the rear, her eyes remained fixed on Ava. With every passing moment, her conviction grew stronger that she had committed a grave error. Just as she was on the verge of dismissing the thought, Miranda's gaze was captured by the front of the plane. At 11:23, she noticed a senior crew member engaged in a more intense than usual conversation with a flight supervisor in the galley. Text. As the supervisor's eyes shifted to Miranda, realization suddenly dawned on her. Something was unfolding. Someone had observed. The murmurs among the passengers had intensified, and it seemed that a report had been made. Before long, Miranda's phone vibrated softly, the gentle hum, an indication that a shift had occurred. She snatched it swiftly, her fingers quivering just a bit. An urgent request for her presence in the galley came from a manager. She felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. She sensed that this was the moment. With a deep breath, she headed toward the galley, her thoughts swirling. As she walked through the cabin, it felt as though the passenger's gaze was tracking her every move. For the first time, Miranda sensed the intensity of their stare. She arrived at the galley where the flight supervisor awaited her, appearing much more solemn than normal. "Emily Harper," the supervisor remarked, her tone subdued. "You relocated her from first class." Miranda stood still for a moment, her heart racing in her chest. "Yes, I did," she replied, her voice scarcely audible. The supervisor's gaze sharpened. "Are you aware of her identity?" Miranda blinked, perplexed. "What are you trying to say?" She occupied the incorrect seat. "I had to relocate her." The supervisor's demeanor softened a bit, yet still held a serious tone. "Miss Carter is not merely an ordinary passenger, Miranda. She is the daughter of the airline's owner." The revelation struck Miranda like a sudden blow. A chill ran down her spine as she felt a cold sweat forming. All her assumptions, every judgment she had passed, were built on a foundation of misunderstanding. "You've got it wrong," the supervisor added, her tone now laced with worry. "You must approach this with caution moving forward." Miranda's stomach sank. She was at a loss for how to remedy the situation now. She had overstepped her bounds and there was no turning back. Yet she needed to respond swiftly. The anxiety that had been accumulating in her chest now engulfed her whole being, leaving her feeling utterly powerless. As Miranda made her way back to the main cabin, her legs felt as though they might buckle under her. The weight of having just offended the daughter of the airline's owner struck her like a freight train. Her thoughts spiraled as she attempted to comprehend the situation. How had she been so oblivious? How could her assumptions have led her astray? She replayed the entire conversation in her mind. Each word, each step, and with every repetition, the burden of her error became increasingly oppressive. As she neared the front of the plane, the sounds of the cabin seemed muted to her. The familiar buzz of conversations and the clattering of drink trays felt far away. She was acutely conscious of every movement, every gaze directed at her. She had just committed a significant mistake, one that she couldn't easily dismiss. It transcended her job. It was about how she had treated an individual who had shown nothing but courtesy, only to be displaced from her rightful position due to assumptions. In contrast, Ava remained composed. She sat in the back, her posture poised and graceful, as if her day had gone uninterrupted. Miranda observed with growing discomfort how indifferent Ava appeared. There was no sign of anger or distress, which only heightened Miranda's anxiety. It felt as though Ava was fully aware of the situation, perhaps even anticipating it. The unsettling tranquility in Ava's behavior deepened Miranda's sense of unease. She attempted to dismiss the feeling. She couldn't allow this to impact her any further than it already had, yet it was impossible to overlook. Her mind kept returning to the same realization. She had miscalculated Ava, and now she had to bear the repercussions. The burden of the situation was starting to feel insurmountable. What would unfold upon their arrival? Would she lose her job? Would the entire crew discover her actions? Would anyone recognize her true self? Just a flight attendant whose judgments had led to her downfall. The remainder of the flight felt interminable. Miranda attempted to fulfill her responsibilities, attending to passengers and serving drinks, but her motions were rigid and mechanical. She felt increasingly powerless in the situation. Each time she walked past Ava, she noticed the woman's serene, collected demeanor. It was as though Ava's quiet strength radiated an unspoken authority, making Miranda feel even more insignificant. The sensation of being observed lingered, and even when Ava's gaze was elsewhere, Miranda's anxiety intensified as the plane began its descent. She struggled to focus, her thoughts a tangled mess. The burden of her choices bore down on her, an oppressive force she couldn't shake off. The most painful realization was that there was no way to remedy the situation now. The harm was already inflicted. Just as the aircraft began its descent, the captain's voice resonated through the intercom. Miranda hardly took in his words, overwhelmed by the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. She had made a mistake, and now she was uncertain about what awaited them upon landing. However, one thing was clear. Emily Harper was not someone to be easily dismissed. Miranda was oblivious to how far this situation would unfold. A heaviness settled in her chest as the cabin fell silent, indicating that the plane was approaching its destination. Miranda could feel that Ava was anticipating something, yet she couldn't quite grasp what it was. It seemed as though Ava was simply biding her time, observing the situation as it developed. The flight attendant was visibly tense, her every action now dictated by unease. The truth was dawning on her. Ava possessed knowledge that others were oblivious to, and for the first time, Miranda was starting to recognize just how deeply she had misjudged the woman she had attempted to dismiss. The plane landed gently. However, for Miranda, the descent felt like a gradual plunge. As the seatbelt sign dimmed, indicating it was time for passengers to unbuckle, the buzz of activity around her grew louder. People rose to grab their bags, engaging in friendly conversation as they readied to leave the aircraft. Yet Miranda sensed she was enveloped in a haze. The burden of the circumstances bore down on her, and each step seemed to lead her closer to unavoidable outcomes she couldn't evade. She attempted to concentrate on the passengers getting off, mustering a smile as she distributed drinks and engaged in light conversation. However, her thoughts wandered far away. Occasionally, her gaze would drift to the rear of the cabin where Ava remained seated. Ava showed no signs of urgency to disembark, her composure unwavering. Miranda sensed Ava's presence, an intangible pressure in the atmosphere. It felt as though Ava possessed an awareness of all that was to come, patiently biding her time for the opportune moment to intervene. Miranda's discomfort intensified as time passed. She looked toward the front of the plane, noticing that the first-class section was almost vacant, and her stomach twisted. Whispers began to rise, with passengers stealing glances at her, some likely pondering the earlier strain. The weight of her actions was beginning to sink in. She had displaced someone without justification, forming conclusions solely based on her looks, and now it seemed as though the entire plane was quietly scrutinizing her. As the final passengers exited, Miranda found herself alone in the cabin with the remaining crew. She noticed Michael Turner, a more experienced flight attendant, observing her from across the galley. His eyes were keen, evaluating as if he had already picked up on the change in the air. Miranda found it impossible to look away from him. She was aware he could feel that something was amiss. The moment lingered. Miranda stood at the front of the plane, striving to keep her calm, but the tension was now almost overwhelming. She believed she could manage any challenge that arose. However, this was unlike anything she had faced before. She had breached a boundary she hadn't even known was there. Now everything was beginning to fall apart. He sensed that something had gone horribly awry, and he was uncertain about the extent of the issue. "Is everything okay?" Michael Turner inquired, his voice soft yet imbued with a significant gravity. Miranda nodded, even though the response seemed disingenuous. "I'm fine," she murmured, attempting to appear nonchalant, but the tremor in her voice revealed her anxiety. She avoided his gaze, and Michael Turner remained skeptical. He regarded her with a prolonged, thoughtful gaze before exhaling deeply and shaking his head. "You ought to have known better, Miranda. First class isn't for the inexperienced," he remarked, his tone subdued, carrying a hint of caution. "Individuals like Ava don't merely remain silent. Your actions today have crossed a boundary, and this will lead to issues." Miranda gulped, her throat parched. At 2450, Michael Turner's remarks hurt more than she had anticipated. She had always taken great pride in her role as a flight attendant, someone well-versed in the nuances of customer service, capable of managing any situation that arose. However, as she stood before Michael Turner, she couldn't shake the feeling of being a total novice, unfit for the responsibilities of this role. She was increasingly burdened by the unsettling sense that she had committed a grave error, and the awareness weighed on her more with each passing moment. Upon returning to her station, the captain's words resonated in her thoughts. The airline's credibility is at stake. What was that supposed to signify for her? Is it possible that she might lose her job because of this? Will she face consequences? What is the situation with Ava? What would unfold once the reality of the situation was revealed? Miranda couldn't foresee the extent of this situation, yet she was beginning to realize that it transcended mere her error. It pertained to a more significant matter, something much greater than herself. Miranda cast another look toward the rear of the plane, where Ava remained seated. In spite of all that had transpired, Ava maintained her composure, standing tall with her eyes focused on a distant point. She appeared entirely relaxed, as though none of this had affected her at all, and that, above all else, disturbed Miranda. Ava's connection to the airline's owner was more than just a simple fact. It was her poise, the manner in which she responded to being shifted from her seat with nothing but serene elegance. Ava was not one to cause a fuss, yet Miranda could feel that there was something deeper going on. Ava was strategic, composed, and above all, she maintained her control. From the beginning, Miranda had miscalculated her, believing she could manipulate her solely based on her own prejudices. As the plane descended toward its destination, Miranda felt an increasing sense of unease. Ava's serene assurance felt like an introduction to something far more significant. It wasn't solely about the seat or the error that Miranda had committed. The focus was on the underlying power dynamics involved. In that instant, Miranda understood that she had misjudged Ava, and she was on the verge of facing the consequences of that error. The aircraft landed gracefully, and the familiar hustle and bustle of passengers getting ready to exit enveloped the cabin. However, for Miranda, the feeling of unease only grew stronger as she observed the orderly procession of passengers heading toward the exit. Although the seatbelt sign was no longer illuminated, she felt anchored in place, unable to shift or concentrate. The burden of all that had transpired felt increasingly heavy on her shoulders with each fleeting moment. Miranda sensed the gaze of her fellow crew members upon her. They navigated around her with effortless skill, executing their tasks, yet she felt entirely like an outsider. She found herself unable to shake off the earlier conversation with the captain, Emily Harper, the offspring of the airline's proprietor. Miranda had rushed to a conclusion, and now she was facing the repercussions. As the final passengers exited down the aisle, Miranda sensed her isolation. She no longer had a place here, not after her actions. The murmurs had begun some time ago, but now she sensed the gaze of her fellow crew members upon her. Their judgment is evident in their silence. A palpable unease hung in the air, as if everyone could feel that something was amiss. They were uncertain about the specifics of what had occurred, yet they sensed it clearly. The air was heavy with unvoiced inquiries. The plane's door swung open, allowing the refreshing air from the jet bridge to sweep inside. Passengers started to disembark, engaged in light conversation, unaware of the turmoil simmering just below the surface. Miranda remained motionless, her mind racing. The murmur of the discussion enveloped her, yet it seemed far away, as though she were encased in a bubble, isolated from reality. As she noticed the flight supervisor coming closer, a worried expression was clearly visible on her face. Miranda sensed a tightness in her throat. At 2900 hours, it became evident that an event was imminent, and she felt powerless to prevent it. The supervisor approached, her demeanor grave. "Miranda," she spoke softly, her tone imbued with a significance that Miranda found impossible to dismiss. "Would you accompany me? The captain wishes to have a word with you." Miranda felt her heart pounding. She nodded, yet her legs felt weighted as she walked toward the galley. She sensed the gaze of her fellow crew members, tracking her every action, the burden of their stares bearing down on her. The journey seemed to stretch on forever. Every step served as a reminder of the error she had committed. When she arrived at the galley, her hands were shaking. The captain stood alongside the senior staff. His expression was inscrutable, yet a palpable tension hung in the air, causing Miranda's stomach to churn. She had anticipated this moment, yet now that it had arrived, she found herself at a loss for words. "Miranda," the captain started, his voice steady yet gentle, "we must talk about what happened on the flight." Miranda felt a tightness in her chest. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She sensed the intensity of the captain's stare, as though he could see directly into her soul. She could not evade the truth of her actions. "Miss Carter," the captain went on, "is far from an ordinary passenger. As the daughter of the airline's owner, she has made it evident that she has not been treated appropriately. This is an important issue, Miranda." Miranda experienced a surge of panic swell within her chest. She was unaware of the profound extent to which this would unfold. In her view, it was merely a simple error, a genuine oversight, at least as she saw it. She never intended to inflict any damage, yet now the repercussions were glaringly evident. The captain's tone became gentler, yet his words carried the same weight. "You've erred, and this will have consequences, but it's crucial for you to realize that the airline's reputation is at stake here. This extends well beyond merely the two of you." Miranda's thoughts were in a whirlwind. Her legs wobbled, and she braced herself against the galley counter for stability. She had felt an unwavering certainty when she relocated Ava, fully convinced that her actions were justified. Yet as she stood before the captain and the senior staff, it became clear to her just how mistaken she had been. "I had no idea who she was," Miranda murmured, her voice scarcely audible. "I believed I was merely adhering to the established procedures. I never intended for any of this to occur." The captain gazed at her, his demeanor becoming more severe. "You took action without justification, and now we find ourselves in a predicament." He hesitated, weighing his next words. "A thorough investigation will be conducted regarding this matter, Miranda. In the meantime, I need you to keep a low profile. Let's ensure this situation doesn't escalate further." Miranda nodded, feeling the gravity of his words press down on her. There was nothing she could utter to improve the situation. She had erred, and now she must confront the repercussions, regardless of how harsh they could be. As the captain turned and departed, Miranda stayed in the galley, her heart racing. The weight of her actions was settling in, and there was no way to evade it. Emily Harper was more than just a passenger. She represented the airline's future, and Miranda had inadvertently put herself at odds with her. The prospect of dealing with the consequences was daunting, and as Miranda lingered, it became increasingly clear that there was no straightforward escape. The moments that followed unfolded in a haze for Miranda. She hardly noticed the last few passengers leaving the plane, the cabins slowly becoming vacant as they made their way out. The once vibrant ambiance of the aircraft now seemed empty, and all Miranda could focus on was her discussion with the captain and the unsettling sensation in her stomach. She had attempted to suppress it to uphold her professionalism, yet her thoughts continually returned to a single idea. She had committed an irrevocable error. The awareness pressed down on her, and the remorse felt all-consuming. She found herself endlessly replaying the moments in her head. The manner in which she had brushed off Ava, presuming she was unworthy of first class. How effortlessly her biases had obscured her perception. Now positioned at the front of the plane, she sensed the gaze of the remaining crew members upon her, acutely aware that the entire situation was on the verge of spiraling out of her control. Michael Turner, always the experienced hand, had completed his task and was now hanging back in the galley, his eyes reflecting a subtle worry. He didn't have to utter a word for Miranda to realize that he comprehended. The guilt weighing on her heart served as a silent admission. She could hear the faint chatter of voices from the terminal beyond. The crew had completed their tasks, yet the atmosphere in the cabin remained heavy with tension. As the final crew members started to conclude their work, Miranda sensed she was trapped in a state of limbo. The world beyond the plane felt far away and unattainable, while within, she sensed everything tightening around her. Michael Turner continued to observe her, as if anticipating her next action. The silence became unbearable. "I messed up," she murmured, her voice scarcely a whisper. "I didn't think. I just acted. I never imagined there was more to her than what met the eye." Michael Turner inhaled deeply and moved a bit closer, his expression softening slightly. He had always been inclined to see the best in her, yet even he recognized that this situation couldn't be overlooked. "You didn't think, Miranda." "That's the issue," Michael Turner said softly. "You need to rely on your instincts. However, it's crucial to evaluate those instincts when they stem from assumptions. Today you overstepped. You made a decision based on her appearance, not on any wrongdoing on her part." Miranda shut her eyes, allowing the gravity of his words to penetrate her thoughts. She had believed she was fulfilling her responsibilities, convinced she was adhering to the protocol. Yet as she faced Michael Turner, it became clear how mistaken she truly was. She had been so certain, so self-assured that her choices were correct. In truth, she had allowed her prejudices to obstruct her from doing what was just. The noise of the terminal outside grew louder, indicating the plane was nearing the end of its unloading process. However, within the confines of the space, everything felt suspended, as if time had come to a standstill. Miranda found herself unable to take a step. She had made a choice in an instant, one that would have significant repercussions. She realized that there was no way to reverse her actions, despite her deep longing to do so. As she remained in place, the intercom suddenly came to life. The captain's voice was steady, yet authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you choosing to fly with us today. We trust you had a pleasant journey, and as always, do not hesitate to reach out if you require any additional assistance. To the remaining crew, please remain on board for a debriefing." Miranda felt a tightening in her chest at the announcement of the debriefing. She was acutely aware that her error would be the focal point of the conversation. The consequences of her actions were just starting to unfold, and she could already feel the weight of what lay ahead. She was no longer just facing an irate passenger. This situation had escalated into something far more significant. The scrutiny of the entire airline, and perhaps even the public, would soon be directed at her. Michael Turner's expression softened as he noticed Miranda's demeanor deteriorate. He understood her emotions and felt no resentment towards her. The repercussions would be substantial, and he was uncertain about the outcome. All he could provide was a soft sigh of comprehension. "We'll make it through this," Michael Turner stated, his tone unwavering. "But you need to take responsibility for it. You must confront the repercussions." Miranda gave a slow nod, her throat constricted with feeling. Uncertain of what lay ahead, she recognized that it was no longer within her grasp. The sole option available to her was to acknowledge the reality of the situation and prepare herself for what lay ahead. As she stood in the galley, the reverberations of her error filling the vacant cabin, Miranda understood that this flight was more than merely traveling from one location to another. It had turned into the path of her own demise. The soft drone of the nearly vacant plane appeared to taunt Miranda as she lingered in the galley, gazing out at the terminal. The team had fulfilled their responsibilities, yet the atmosphere remained heavy with expectation. Her heart raced in her chest, each thump a reminder of the error she had committed and the realization that the repercussions were only starting to emerge. She attempted to calm her breath, but it was proving ineffective. Despite her attempts to calm herself with deep breaths, the sensation of being ensnared in a web of her own creation lingered on. She had acted on her assumptions and biases, and now she was confronting the consequences. She couldn't deny that she had overstepped a boundary, and the most troubling aspect was her complete unawareness of the extent of the consequences that awaited her. Miranda looked at her phone and saw a series of messages. The majority of the messages came from friends and family inquiring about how her day had been, yet she found it difficult to reply. She understood that as soon as she did, the truth of what had occurred would strike her with greater force. The situation with Ava was not something she could easily dismiss. It was already set in motion, and no amount of apologies could reverse the harm done. She glanced back upon hearing the gentle sound of footsteps trailing behind her. It was Michael Turner, his demeanor serene, yet a trace of compassion flickered in his gaze. He had been with the airline for many years, and while he had encountered his fair share of errors, this particular one stood out. Miranda's error was not related to inadequate service or a mismanaged flight. It was a personal matter. She had formed an opinion about someone based solely on their appearance, and now she would face the consequences. "I heard," Michael Turner started gently, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were attempting to lighten her already significant load. However, within the confines of the space, everything felt suspended, as if time had come to a standstill. Miranda found herself unable to take a step. She had made a choice in an instant, one that would have significant repercussions. She realized that there was no way to reverse her actions, despite her deep longing to do so. As she remained in place, the intercom suddenly came to life. The captain's voice was steady, yet authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you choosing to fly with us today. We trust you had a pleasant journey, and as always, do not hesitate to reach out if you require any additional assistance. To the remaining crew, please remain on board for a debriefing." Miranda felt a tightening in her chest at the announcement of the debriefing. She was acutely aware that her error would be the focal point of the conversation. The consequences of her actions were just starting to unfold, and she could already feel the weight of what lay ahead. She was no longer just facing an irate passenger. This situation had escalated into something far more significant. The scrutiny of the entire airline, and perhaps even the public, would soon be directed at her. Michael Turner's expression softened as he noticed Miranda's demeanor deteriorate. He understood her emotions and felt no resentment towards her. The repercussions would be substantial, and he was uncertain about the outcome. All he could provide was a soft sigh of comprehension. "We'll make it through this," Michael Turner stated, his tone unwavering. "But you need to take responsibility for it. You must confront the repercussions." Miranda gave a slow nod, her throat constricted with feeling. Uncertain of what lay ahead, she recognized that it was no longer within her grasp. The sole option available to her was to acknowledge the reality of the situation and prepare herself for what lay ahead. As she stood in the galley, the reverberations of her error filling the vacant cabin, Miranda understood that this flight was more than merely traveling from one location to another. It had turned into the path of her own demise. The soft drone of the nearly vacant plane appeared to taunt Miranda as she lingered in the galley, gazing out at the terminal. The team had fulfilled their responsibilities, yet the atmosphere remained heavy with expectation. Her heart raced in her chest, each thump a reminder of the error she had committed, and the realization that the repercussions were only starting to emerge. She attempted to calm her breath, but it was proving ineffective. Despite her attempts to calm herself with deep breaths, the sensation of being ensnared in a web of her own creation lingered on. She had acted on her assumptions and biases, and now she was confronting the consequences. She couldn't deny that she had overstepped a boundary, and the most troubling aspect was her complete unawareness of the extent of the consequences that awaited her. Miranda looked at her phone and saw a series of messages. The majority of the messages came from friends and family inquiring about how her day had been, yet she found it difficult to reply. She understood that as soon as she did, the truth of what had occurred would strike her with greater force. The situation with Ava was not something she could easily dismiss. It was already set in motion, and no amount of apologies could reverse the harm done. She glanced back upon hearing the gentle sound of footsteps trailing behind her. It was Michael Turner, his demeanor serene, yet a trace of compassion flickered in his gaze. He had been with the airline for many years, and while he had encountered his fair share of errors, This particular one stood out. Miranda's error was not related to inadequate service or a mismanaged flight. It was a personal matter. She had formed an opinion about someone based solely on their appearance, and now she would face the consequences. "I heard," Michael Turner started gently, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were attempting to lighten her already significant load. "The board has been informed. An official review is on the horizon. I'm uncertain about the outcome, but you need to brace yourself for whatever lies ahead." Miranda swallowed hard, striving to maintain her composure. "I never intended for any of this to occur. I simply didn't consider it. I rushed my decision." Her voice wavered, leaving her unable to complete the sentence. Michael Turner gave a slow nod. "I understand, but at this point, it's beyond your control. The board will take care of it, but you must confront whatever choice they arrive at, and you need to take responsibility for your actions. It's inescapable." Miranda shut her eyes, striving to hold back the surge of frustration and regret that loomed over her. "I am astonished by how mistaken I was. I believed I was making the right choice. I assumed she didn't have a place there, yet I failed to thoroughly examine her ticket. I merely presumed." "That's the issue," Michael Turner interrupted, his voice steady yet gentle. "You made an assumption. Assumptions can lead to significant losses. Your reputation is at stake, not just your job. Such decisions cannot be made in that manner. This position doesn't allow for that. Not with anyone at all, particularly not with someone who has connections." Miranda's stomach sank at his words. She understood that Ava was more than just a typical passenger. She observed the crew's response to her composed and serene presence. At last, everything clicked into place. Ava was no ordinary traveler. She possessed strength. Miranda had been naive to underestimate her. As the final members of the crew approached the exit, Miranda sensed the gravity of the situation pressing down on her. The stillness had become suffocating. Silence enveloped the room, and she found it impossible to meet anyone's gaze. She was completely unaware of what awaited her once she stepped off the plane. Is she facing suspension or termination? She was uncertain, yet she sensed that her reality was disintegrating bit by bit. Noticing her increasing unease, Michael Turner offered her a gentle, comforting nod. "You will confront whatever comes next, Miranda, but it's essential that you take lessons from this experience. I have faith that you will." Miranda remained silent. No further words were necessary. The lesson was grasped too late, and now she must confront the repercussions. As she stepped off the plane behind Michael Turner and entered the terminal, she sensed a transformation within herself, as if she had become someone adrift, someone who had miscalculated everything. The terminal was alive with energy as passengers rushed to board their flights, the clatter of rolling suitcases and the announcements of boarding calls resonating throughout the space. Yet for Miranda, everything seemed remote, as though she were traversing a dreamscape. While the world continued to progress, she found herself frozen in time, anticipating the unavoidable consequences. At that moment, she had never experienced such a sense of insignificance. She had never experienced such a sense of helplessness. And still, beneath the surface, a part of her recognized that this was the pivotal moment that would shape everything. The repercussions of her choices were only starting to unfold, and she had no option but to confront them directly. No matter what transpired afterward, she understood that she would have to accept it. At 43 minutes past the hour, Miranda walked into the frigid, clinical corridor that extended from the aircraft. Her feet shuffled, burdened by the heaviness of her own reflections. The terminal was alive with activity, travelers hurrying to their gates, children giggling, and the rhythmic clatter of luggage wheels resonating in the air. Yet for Miranda, all was muted. It seemed to her as if she were traversing a thick mist. Everything around her was in constant motion, pulsating with a speed and energy that she struggled to match. Her thoughts surged with every conceivable scenario of the situation. Regardless of the countless scenarios she envisioned, none seemed to promise a favorable outcome for her. She arrived at the staff exit and hesitated briefly, inhaling unsteadily before she opened the door. The refreshing night breeze enveloped her, yet it did little to dispel the fog that lingered in her thoughts. Her thoughts were consumed by Ava. Emily Harper, the daughter of the airline's owner, was someone Miranda had assessed solely on her looks. With every step she took, The weight of her actions began to sink in more profoundly. She had crossed the wrong individual, and now she would face the repercussions. Miranda felt her phone vibrate in her pocket, and as she retrieved it, a wave of dread washed over her upon seeing the notification. A communication from the airline's HR department was received. While she anticipated this outcome, the message's crisp, authoritative tone unsettled her stomach. At that moment, it was evident that her actions were already igniting something far greater than her own influence. A meeting is set for tomorrow at 9 a.m., a hearing to address the incident involving Flight 287 and its consequences. While she read the message, the words began to fade and lose clarity before her eyes. Her hands shook ever so slightly, the phone falling from her hand as she struggled to concentrate. She had anticipated this moment, but reading it in black and white made it feel undeniably tangible. The company was treating this matter with excessive seriousness, much to Miranda's discontent. Her behavior, the belief that Ava was out of place in first class, had now thrust her into the eye of a tempest. She exhaled deeply, her breath trembling, as she slipped the phone back into her pocket. She was uncertain about what the hearing would reveal, yet she was confident of one thing. She was trapped in this situation. That's no longer the case. Ava was far from an ordinary passenger. She possessed great influence. Her actions would resonate throughout the airline and perhaps even further. Miranda was unaware of the complete scope of what was about to unfold. However, she was aware that her career, her reputation, and all her hard work were at stake. While heading to her car, the outside world appeared just as tumultuous as the storm raging within her thoughts. As she approached her car, just before she could unlock it, her phone buzzed once more. A different message. This time it was Michael Turner, the seasoned flight attendant who had noticed the change in the atmosphere. The communication was concise yet direct. You are not facing this by yourself. Ensure that you own your actions. For a brief instant, Miranda considered reaching out to Michael Turner, hoping for guidance or perhaps a bit of solace. Yet the words he had shared with her earlier resonated in her thoughts. She had made decisions based on assumptions, and now there was no way to reverse her actions. The night sky loomed above her, shrouded in darkness and silence, providing neither comfort nor clarity. She got into her car and lingered there for a while, gazing out the windshield. The choice she had made on the plane, hasty and driven by her own prejudices, now felt so far away, so unwise. However, dwelling on regret served no purpose. She could sense the burden of her errors dragging her further into the understanding that the path ahead would be challenging. This issue extended beyond a mere seating error. It highlighted how individuals, even those with good intentions, could inadvertently sustain discrimination. It revolved around the power dynamics she had overlooked and undervalued. Miranda ignited the engine, its roar filling the air. Yet she hesitated to drive off right away. Instead, she remained silent, contemplating how much longer she could maintain the facade that the tempest she had unleashed wasn't approaching her. The reality was inescapable. Her choices would lead to repercussions, and no level of readiness could equip her for what lay ahead. As she left the airport behind, the burden in her chest intensified. The path forward was ambiguous, yet one fact stood out distinctly. Her life had transformed in ways she had yet to fully grasp. The following morning, Miranda hardly got any rest. With each blink, she revisited the moments of the flight, the error that had unraveled into chaos. It wasn't merely that she had miscalculated someone's character. It was that she allowed her prejudice to guide her behavior. She had presumed that Ava was out of place in first class, that she didn't conform to the usual image of a first-class traveler. Now she had to confront the repercussions of that decision. As the sun began to rise, Miranda put on her uniform, which felt stiff and uncomfortable, serving as a persistent reminder of her mistake. She reached the airline's headquarters, her pace deliberate and weighed down. The structure towered in front of her, representing all her efforts, yet now it seemed unfamiliar, even unwelcoming. She had never experienced such a sense of alienation before. Upon entering, Miranda was met by a receptionist who hardly lifted her gaze from her desk as she drew near. "You're here for the hearing, correct?" the receptionist inquired with a calm demeanor. Miranda agreed, her stomach in knots. The formalities felt distant, yet they were inconsequential. At this moment, nothing else held significance except for the impending event. The receptionist presented her with a clipboard filled with forms, and Miranda settled into the clinical waiting area. She found it difficult to concentrate on the documents before her. Her thoughts whirled in a chaotic frenzy. What might be discussed during the hearing? What approach would they take to manage this situation? Is there a possibility that she might lose her job? What about her reputation? She was unaware. What she understood was that there was no way to reverse her actions. The waiting room was unsettlingly silent. The ticking clock echoes through the stillness. Each passing minute seemed to stretch into an hour. Finally, the door to the hearing room swung open, and a senior HR representative gestured for her to enter. Miranda rose to her feet, her legs heavy as if weighed down, and made her way into the room. Within the room, 3 executives were positioned at an elongated conference table. Their gazes locked onto her as she walked in, their faces betraying no emotion. It was devoid of warmth and comfort, characterized solely by a stark professionalism. As the HR representative presented the panel, Miranda felt a wave of dread wash over her, understanding the gravity of the circumstances. The atmosphere of the room was excessively formal and sterile, leaving no room for anything but a serious discussion. She took a seat at the table, feeling diminutive and unimportant beneath the burden of the stairs. Her hands shook gently as she clasped them together in front of her, anticipating the start of the interrogation. "You're aware of the reason for your presence, Miranda," the woman seated opposite her stated, her voice sharp and official. "This concerns the event that occurred on Flight 287. We have carefully examined the circumstances, and we would like to understand your perspective." Miranda nodded, yet the words eluded her. She had believed she could articulate her thoughts, that she could present a justification. But now as she faced the board, the right words escaped her. The error felt insurmountable, too significant to amend. She cleared her throat, attempting to compose herself. I made a mistake," Miranda admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I failed to examine the ticket thoroughly. I mistakenly thought she didn't belong in first class." She paused, the gravity of her statement settling in. "And for that, I sincerely apologize." The room fell silent for a brief moment, executives exchanging looks. Miranda's heart raced as she anticipated their reaction, aware that it would be a challenging one. The man at the head of the table finally addressed the group. "Miranda, your actions were influenced by bias. You relocated a legitimate first-class passenger without justification. This breaches company policy and carries significant repercussions. You've tarnished this airline's reputation." Miranda felt a lump form in her throat. She anticipated the words, yet their delivery intensified the reality of the situation. The weight of how much she had put her career and livelihood at risk crashed down on her in an instant. This was not merely about losing a position. It was about losing everything she had strived to achieve. The burden of her error had never been more overwhelming. The hearing continued, yet each word in question seemed to fade into a haze for Miranda. The executives inquired about the details of the incident, the reasons behind her decision to move Ava, what influenced her choice, and whether she had undergone training on bias and discrimination. She responded to the best of her ability. Yet with each word she uttered, it seemed as though she was descending further into an abyss from which escape felt impossible. The inquiries were justified, and Miranda recognized that she had brought this upon herself. Her negligence had led her to this moment of reckoning. However, it wasn't solely the interrogation that diminished her. It was the piercing gazes of the executives that left her feeling insignificant. Their gaze drifted beyond her, fixated on something far more significant than the individual before them. It was the organization, the image, the standing. Miranda was merely another staff member, another error to be managed. At one moment, the woman facing her inquired, "Were you aware of who Emily Harper was when you transferred her?" Miranda felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. She shook her head, a hint of embarrassment in her voice. "No, I didn't. I was unaware until it was too late." A moment of awkward silence followed as the panel absorbed this revelation. Miranda noticed the disappointment reflected in their eyes, a quiet judgment hanging in the air. This situation transcended Ava. It highlighted a broader concern regarding the treatment of passengers by airline staff and the assumptions made based on appearances. The executives shared knowing looks, and Miranda felt her heart drop even more. "We cannot accept bias in this company, Miranda," one of the executives stated, her tone resolute. "Not in any shape or form. You have not only breached our policies but also perpetuated stereotypes that we have diligently sought to eradicate." Miranda's chest constricted. She realized the gravity of her error. It wasn't merely a lapse in judgment. It was her role in fostering an environment of discrimination and bias. This was a matter that transcended the individual. She felt remorse not only for her treatment of Ava, but also for the broader implications of her actions, recognizing how she had inadvertently supported the very mindset she had always sought to challenge. "I see," Miranda murmured, her voice almost a whisper. "I failed to consider the bigger picture." The woman nodded, her demeanor becoming a bit gentler. "And that's our purpose here, to ensure that everyone grasps the importance of preventing this from occurring again. This isn't merely about a single error, Miranda. It's about fostering an environment where such incidents are impossible." Miranda felt a constriction in her throat as she nodded. She had acquired that lesson through difficult experiences, and it would remain with her forever. After what seemed like an endless duration, the hearing concluded. Miranda rose slowly, her body weary and her thoughts in turmoil. The executives cast her one last glance, devoid of comfort or empathy. Yet there was an air of acceptance surrounding the situation. They had reached their conclusion, leaving Miranda with no choice but to bide her time. The HR representative gestured for her to follow, and they proceeded down the lengthy corridor, the sound of their footsteps reverberating through the space. Miranda felt as though she were traversing a dream, caught in a parallel reality where everything appeared unchanged. Yet nothing felt as it should. Once a dedicated flight attendant, known for her reliability and professionalism, she now found herself facing the gravest error of her career, and perhaps her life. The HR representative guided her to a small office where Miranda took a seat at a desk cluttered with paperwork. The woman presented her with a folder, and as Miranda glanced at it, her heart plummeted. Inside was a notice of suspension. It wasn't a termination, but it wasn't an improvement either. She was being put on leave while further investigations took place. The company had indicated that her actions were significant, yet a final decision had not been reached. The suspension was merely the start. "Miranda," the HR representative said, her tone gentler now, though still formal, "you will have to refrain from working until we provide further updates. The board is currently evaluating all aspects and will reach their final decision in a matter of days." Text. "During this period, it would be wise to contemplate your choices." Miranda nodded, rendered speechless by the moment. She grasped the folder, sensing its heaviness in her grasp. Her career was now uncertain, and she questioned if it would ever return to its former state. She had attempted to cling to the familiar, to the stable. Yet everything was gradually fading. The future was unclear, but one thing was evident. It would take a considerable amount of time before she could move beyond the repercussions of this error. As Miranda exited the office and made her way through the building's corridors, she felt the burden of her choices bearing down on her, overwhelming her. Uncertain of the outcome once the investigation concluded, she was certain of one thing: everything would change forever. Neither for her nor for the airline. The days after the hearing passed in a haze. Miranda found herself mostly at home, pacing around her apartment, unable to remain still for any length of time. The suspension notice hung over her like a shadow. With each hour that ticked by, the pressure in her chest intensified. The atmosphere was heavy with doubt, and it felt as though time was both racing and dragging. She found herself revisiting the hearing repeatedly, the executive's words resonating in her thoughts. "You've breached our policies. Bias is unacceptable here. You've harmed the reputation of this airline." She felt defenseless. There was no rationale for her actions. It was the gravest error she had ever committed, and it had cost her far more than merely a seat on a plane. Miranda began to doubt everything. How could she have been so reckless? How could she have allowed her assumptions about another person, about anyone, to obscure her judgment? She had always viewed herself as a decent individual, someone who refrained from judging others based on their looks. In that instant when she laid eyes on Ava, Her own prejudices had clouded her judgment. Now she was facing the consequences. The weight of guilt was overwhelming, and she felt lost on how to alleviate it. She steered clear of social media, fully aware that the incident had already sparked discussions. Ava's name was probably making the rounds in corporate environments, and she envisioned the narrative expanding as more individuals became aware of it. The prospect of being examined so closely, coupled with the awareness of her error, plunged her deeper into a vortex of self-doubt. It wasn't solely about the risk of losing her job, although that loomed large. It was the harm done to her integrity. The realization that she had allowed a baseless assumption to dictate her choices was devastating. She found herself entangled in a system that upheld bias, regardless of her intentions. That understanding was more painful than anything else. On the fourth day of her suspension, Miranda received a call from the HR representative. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone, already anticipating the words she feared would come next. "Miranda, I'm calling to let you know that the board has assessed the situation and reached their decision." The voice on the other end was steady yet resolute, providing no solace. "Your suspension has been prolonged for another week. The investigation continues, and we will inform you once a final decision is reached." Miranda felt her heart sink, leaving her momentarily speechless. She had anticipated this, yet hearing it spoken still hurt. A part of her had wished for a different result, even if it was unlikely. The anticipation and doubt were growing increasingly intolerable. She whispered her gratitude before ending the call and collapsing onto the couch. The burden of all her actions felt even more profound now. She was powerless to change the result, unable to mend what had already been shattered. All that remained was to wait. It was the most dreadful sensation she had ever experienced. As the day wore on, Miranda sought to occupy her mind. She tidied her apartment, strolled through the park, and even attempted to read. Yet nothing appeared to alleviate the emptiness created by the doubt that was consuming her. It wasn't merely the suspension or the threat of losing her job. She came to understand that her actions carried repercussions that extended far beyond her initial expectations. The airline had previously announced their intention to revamp their training programs, emphasizing the importance of addressing bias and discrimination. The public uproar was more intense than Miranda had expected. At 1:01:13, various news organizations began covering the story, and her actions sparked intense discussion. She was surprised to find herself at the heart of a discussion regarding workplace bias. She was surprised to find her name linked to something so important. She believed she was merely fulfilling her responsibilities by addressing the seating problem. However, everything had changed now. She was the one who initiated a discussion regarding the systemic issues within the airline, highlighting the assumptions people often make when they fail to reflect. She felt a sense of shame about it, the aspect of her that desired to remain unnoticed and fade into the surroundings. Yet a different part of her understood that a change was necessary. Perhaps, just perhaps, her error might bring about that transformation. If it can assist others in steering clear of similar biases and errors, then it would have been worthwhile. However, the price had been steep. She reflected on Ava, the woman she had relocated from first class. Ava managed the situation with poise. However, Miranda understood that Ava possessed qualities beyond her serene exterior. She was the driving force behind the transformation. The incident during the flight had unsettled the airline. However, they had also created an opportunity for genuine, enduring transformation in the way employees interacted with their passengers and with one another. Ava possessed knowledge that Miranda was unaware of, the strength of responsibility. Despite her reluctance to acknowledge it, Miranda found herself admiring that strength. Ava leveraged the situation to advocate for accountability, not only for herself but for the whole organization. She accomplished something that Miranda had never even thought could be done. She transformed a moment of embarrassment into a chance for growth. Miranda doubted whether she could ever truly atone for her actions. Yet she had gained insight during these days of anticipation. She discovered that there is always an opportunity for development, introspection, and transformation. She still had the chance to set things straight, but it all had to begin with her own actions. After a week of waiting, the call finally arrived. Miranda felt a wave of unease as she responded, the recognizable voice of the HR representative on the line. The moment she had feared was finally upon her. Miranda, the representative started, a conclusive decision has been made concerning the incident on Flight 287. Miranda sensed the heaviness in the woman's tone. The tone was neutral and professional, yet Miranda sensed an unmistakable undercurrent of finality deep within her. Her heart raced as she listened intently. Each moment stretches on endlessly. We acknowledge that your actions were inappropriate, but we recognize that this was an error stemming from unintentional bias. You have demonstrated regret and indicated your desire to grow from this situation. The representative hesitated, and Miranda sensed a tightening in her chest. You will be restored to your role with the requirement of further sensitivity training. However, your future with the company depends on your ongoing development and comprehension of the necessity to respect every passenger. We anticipate complete collaboration in executing the changes we are striving to implement throughout the airline. For the next 6 months, you will be under probation. Any additional infractions will necessitate a review of your role. Miranda experienced a wave of relief, yet it was moderated by the seriousness of her choice. She was not being let go. She had received another opportunity, yet the journey ahead promised to be much more challenging than she had anticipated. "Thank you," Miranda murmured, her voice heavy with feeling. At a loss for words, she realized the challenge ahead. An opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities lay before her, yet it would require immense effort. She needed to push herself further, acquire new knowledge, and prove her worth. After ending the call, Miranda leaned back, her hands trembling just a bit. She had received a second opportunity, yet she understood that it would require all her strength to ensure she didn't waste it. A lengthy journey lay ahead, but she was prepared to embark on it. Ava had been correct. Taking responsibility was the initial step toward transformation. The story of Miranda and Ava teaches us that unconscious bias can have serious consequences. Miranda made a snap judgment on Ava based on her appearance and did not check her ticket carefully, which not only hurt Ava, but also threatened her career and the reputation of the airline. The lesson is to be aware of and control your personal bias and always act with fairness and respect. Even where cultural diversity is a feature, unconscious bias still exists in areas such as work, education, and services. For example, studies show that people of color or women are often misjudged in the workplace, leading to inequality of opportunity. This story reminds us to be careful in our judgments, especially when we are in roles that influence others. Everyone should practice self-awareness, question their assumptions, and participate in diversity and inclusion training. In your daily life, listen, respect, and treat everyone fairly, regardless of appearance or background. This not only creates a professional work environment, but also contributes to a more equitable society, true to America's core values of equality and freedom. Small actions like double-checking information before making a decision or sincerely apologizing when you're wrong can make a big difference. Let Miranda's lesson motivate you to be more responsible and open every day.